Hi everybody, it's Kevin here again, and as you can see, I'm with Seth, and Seth is in St Lucia.
St. Vincent.
See, I knew I'd get it wrong.
I was in St. Lucia.
You
No, I lived
wanted
in
to-
St. Vincent for
yeah.
27 years.
Ah, right, okay. Now this is part three of my chat with Seth, and this third part is going to be about Seth's time in the Navy, which Seth has already hinted at in part two. But also we want to get to, or I want to talk to Seth about a very important part in the history of the Navy, whether it's a good part of the history of the Navy as a submariner, we'll find out shortly. So Seth, can you just give us a brief description about the time in the Navy, but then how you became a submariner, and then when you subsequently found out where you were going to go?
Oh. Yeah, I joined BRNC Dartmouth, the Britannia Royal Naval College, on the 11th of September 1974. Did about a year and a half's training. Left the college, passed out. Princess Margaret was actually the guest of honor at the parade, but I missed her because I was upstairs in one of the cabins with a young lady having a private chat. And when it came to be Princess Margaret's turn to actually meet the officers who had just passed out, they wouldn't let me in because the security guards were all in there, and so was a Royal Highness. So I didn't get to meet her. But anyway, I passed out, and I then had to spend a period of time under training at sea. And the first vessel I was sent to was a mine hunter, HMS Bossington, which was based at HMS Vernon, the shore establishment for mine warfare and divers in Portsmouth. I spent a very, very happy 4 months on HMS Bossington, was also promoted sub-lieutenant, got my first stripe on board that ship. And we visited a few foreign ports, Germany, and we went to Holland, France, a couple of other places. I was then transferred to another ship, a Type 12 frigate, HMS Brighton, and I spent the following 4 or 5 months on HMS Brighton. We spent a lot of time in the Mediterranean, in Malta and Italy, Greece, places like that, Gibraltar, and then back home, where I then had to sit examinations, basically the end of my training period. I passed the examinations and managed to earn a little bit of extra seniority. And I was at that time, I joined as what's called an executive officer, which is basically the seaman branch. But I had a slightly defective eye with poor vision in one eye. And because of that, and also because of choice, I actually changed to the supply and secretariat, which today is called the logistics branch, and nickname a pusser after purser. I spent some time doing supply and secretariat training on board a decommissioned ship, actually in Plymouth, that was used as basically an office and a storage vessel. And I received my first appointment, in inverted commas, in 1977, where I flew to Gibraltar on an RAF plane and joined Britain's last aircraft carrier, HMS Ark Royal.
Oh, wow, yeah.
I spent more than 2 years on Ark Royal, I think, if my maths is correct, 77, 78, no, sorry, almost 2 years. We also did we went to a lot of Mediterranean ports again, and then did the last visit to the USA, crossing the Atlantic and being welcomed even with overflying aircraft.
Wow.
One of them flying a banner, mistakenly reading "Welcome HMS Royal Ark."
Oh.
That raised a few giggles. Somebody had there's a photograph of it around somewhere.
Yeah.
We went to Fort Lauderdale, was our first port. We then went to Mayport in Florida, where we actually spent 8 weeks doing a maintenance period. which was great because most of us got a couple of weeks off and were able to, see a little bit more of the country. Myself and a friend actually hitchhiked down to New Orleans and got arrested for being drunk in public. Fortunately, we didn't bring that to Her Majesty's attention.
Yes.
And with the loss of $30 and a somewhat severe-looking judge, we then hitchhiked back to Mayport and hung our heads. We then came back across the Atlantic, and the ship decommissioned officially on its last arrival in Plymouth at the beginning of December 1978. And I then remained on board for another 5 months during what was known as the decommissioning period, which, as you can imagine, with a ship more than 850 feet long and with more than 25 decks and standard crew of about 2,500 people, which increased significantly when the air crews were on board. There was a hell of a lot of stuff to decommission. So literally compartment by compartment, which were then sealed with wire ties once they'd been emptied. We had a fantastic leaving party, the last wardroom party held at the Plymouth Gin Distillery. I think there were 12 or 13 of us. And in fact, as recently, I was promoted also to from assistant administration secretary to the personnel secretary, where I actually typed up the reports of every officer on board the ship, with the exclusion of the captain. So it was a bit of quite an honorable position in a way, because the confidentiality of actually typing the reports of the commanders of the ship and having to keep my mouth fairly shut. I was then promoted when we started decommissioning to the captain's secretary, which had previously been a lieutenant commander. And I spent 5 months as the captain's personal secretary with keys to his safe. Again, quite an honored position. And in fact, the captain of the ship came and visited me here in St. Vincent 8 years ago, because I remained in touch with him until about 4 or 5 years ago. Captain O'Donnell, Guy O'Donnell, who was a four-stripe captain and ended up being the captain of the Royal Naval College, Greenwich, and subsequently moved to the USA, to Florida, where he's lived for more than 40 years with his good lady, his wife, who is also a British, who lived in Jamaica. After Ark Royal, well, actually, when I was on Ark Royal, I had applied to join the submarine service. There were several reasons. Although I was doing fairly well in the Navy, I cannot say that I found the formality, particularly of the officers' areas, particularly welcoming. Whilst I'm told that I have an upmarket accent, I'm a chap that actually prefers to be on the street barefoot. Not sitting there fancy dress and with, I believe they're called toffee noses. Not apples. So that was one of the reasons. The other reason was that the majority of my closest friends in the Navy were seaman officers and had all rushed into the submarine service. And I liked what I'd heard of it, although I didn't know much about it. I went on a couple of weeks sort of sample training cruise to see what I thought of submarines. It was one of the old diesel boats, not long after the Second World War, 1950s. Very small. First few days on board, sleeping on a torpedo rack with a mattress, because there were no beds, etc. So a little bit tough, a little bit tight, and a smell of diesel from one end of the submarine back to the other. And when diesel submariners then used to disembark the submarine, and in non-naval ports they would be accommodated, and so would we on nuclear submarines, be accommodated in a hotel. The diesel submariners would literally have to have 4 or 5 baths to rid themselves of the diesel. The skin of the body, actually, especially the engineers, actually absorbed through their skin. And through the clothes, which had to be washed many, many times. So it was a bit of a messy environment, the diesel submarine service. But one that was highly regarded.
Mm.
I then did my submarine training at HMS Dolphin in Portsmouth, which lasted for a few months, including the large escape tower, which everybody who became a submariner had to enter the escape tower with no breathing apparatus and learn how to do a couple of 100 feet ascent. They had divers every few feet up the chamber to make sure you were exhaling. Because if you didn't exhale, your lungs would burst.
Oh wow!
I believe that, and so they would punch you in the stomach if they didn't see to make sure that you were breathing out.
Yeah.
And because of the difference in water pressure and density.
Yeah.
And as far as I gather, only one person ever died in the tower in the many decades for which I can't remember when it opened, but when it opened, I believe that it's been decommissioned now.
Okay.
After the initial submarine training, I then had to go and do nuclear submarine training, and I was sent to the Royal Naval College at Greenwich. And I spent 3 months at Greenwich Naval College doing courses in nuclear engineering. They even had a nuclear reactor there. I'm not sure whether I'm allowed to say that, but in those days, it was actually classified that there was a nuclear reactor in London.
Yeah.
It's a small one. Its name was Jason.
Oh, right. Okay.
And everybody knew it as Jason.
Yeah.
And it was an amazing piece of an instructional equipment because we'd actually walk around this reactor. We had scientists there and had to wear, special gear.
All right.
But it was quite an extraordinary thing
to
look at this. I managed to pass my submarine course, and I was sent to a nuclear submarine, HMS Courageous, for what was known as Part 3 training, which was the at-sea training part of the submarine service. And I spent about 3 or 4 months on HMS Courageous in 1970, late 79, this would have been, and early 82, and early 80. And I passed successfully, and I was awarded my gold dolphins, as they're known, and proudly wore those. The equivalent of a pilot's wings.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And I then waited for my first formal appointment, which came in 1980. I still have the appointment letter, and I'll have all my reports and all the documents from that time. And I was appointed to HMS Conqueror as the ship's supply officer. I joined Conqueror in May 1980 and did my relief, my handover, which lasted about a week, and then settled in and liked it very much. Got on extremely well with everybody on board, wardroom included. There were 11 or 12 officers, a total of about 120 men on board. And off we went. We did various patrols during 1980 and 1981. Of course, at that time, the major task was anti-Soviet.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And so there were a few patrols which involved that type of work.
Yeah.
We also had some rather fun overseas trips. We went to Gibraltar and Naples, Athens, I think, briefly, and a couple of other places. But the greatest came at the beginning of 1982 in January, when we were sent across the Atlantic to the Bahamas. Didn't take T-shirts and sun umbrellas, but we were actually going to an island called Andros, which has a huge channel, very, very deep on one side of it. I believe it's known as the tongue of the ocean.
Oh, right.
It drops to thousands of feet really suddenly. And it's the Atlantic Underwater Testing and Evaluation Center, ORTEC, it's known as, for testing different types of equipment for the Navy. So we spent a long time, 2.5 months in Andros, which was fabulous because occasionally we'd get a day off and wander onto the beach and go and have a beer or something. And we were actually based, it's an American-run place, so there were American shops and American military and American soldiers and drivers and everything else. We arrived back from Andros in March 1982, thinking, great, everybody deserves some leave. We'd had a really busy few months. I can't remember the exact figures, but we'd had something like 10 days at home within the last 4 or 5 months.
Wow.
And so, a lot of the chaps were married and everything and looking forward to a bit of time off. And the majority of the crew were actually still on leave on the 1st of April Fool's Day, of all days, when we started getting some messages that people were being recalled from leave. And I think that the official recall happened probably on the 2nd. And one fellow was actually at a football match somewhere, a big football match. And at half time, they actually had called out his name over the loudspeaker. This was how important our recall was.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we didn't really know much about why the urgency. And the messages that were sent around to people that couldn't be found. The first lieutenant had just, I think, driven all the way to Wales or somewhere like that to go and see his recent wife, and then had to suddenly drive all the way back again. Anyway, it became apparent, obviously, by the 2nd of April that there had been a bit of a skirmish down in the South Atlantic with the Argentinian government, in inverted commas, invading the Falkland Islands. I say in inverted commas because that's how we felt at the time. We didn't really, most people, as Staurt Prebble wrote in his book, sort of, the Falklands, aren't they off the coast of Scotland?
That's right, yeah.
A lot of people, I mean, I'd heard of them, but a lot of people hadn't. So it was quite interesting. It was an extremely busy 2 days because we had to then plan, having no idea what was going to transpire from these events. Would we be at sea for a week and then come back home saying it's all over, or would we end up spending 3 or 4 months away? The longest nuclear submarine could go to sea in those days without coming back into harbour was probably about just over 3 months. 90 days was usually considered to be the maximum. We had to store for about 120 something days.
Wow.
And which was a hell of a task. And I had to look after all of the food, drinks, spare parts, ordering the weapons, paperwork, correspondence, toilet rolls, cigarettes. I mean, everything that we can think of that we had to carry. And it was, the food was unbelievably difficult. Deep freezers, but I had to, myself and a very good friend of mine still today, the petty officer chef, Paul Taylor, we had to sit down and write 3.5 months of menus in the right order so that we could store the food in the right order in the freezer and the storerooms.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if we put everything in the wrong place, we'd have to eat what came out of the front.
Yes, of course, yeah.
And that's what we had to do. So we had to, I had never thought about that at the time, but writing a menu for the next 3.5 months so that you can store the food. We had so much to carry that we had false decks, so that in parts of the submarine, including the main control room, there were cardboard boxes of food on the decks. So we had to sort of walk over hunched up for a little bit until we'd eaten our way through the deck. Quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
We had a very fast passage down south. It was a long way to go, obviously, thousands of miles. And we set off about the 4th of April, 1982. And we arrived took us about 3 weeks moving very fast all of the time and very deep. So we didn't look through periscopes and stuff. A nuclear submarine in those days could go deeper than 750 feet. And so, and the advantage of that is we can go much faster because of the water density and the fact that it's very, very calm. There's none of the liveliness of being close to the surface. And so we ran at high speed. The disadvantage of that is that if you're not very careful, another of my jobs, I was known as the trimming officer. I had to be responsible for the buoyancy of the submarine, pumping water in, pumping water out, moving water from one side to the other. You had to remember that we went to the bathroom and flushed toilets overboard. So the submarine was getting lighter as we were eating our way through food and throwing away garbage.
Yeah.
And you have to compensate for that.
Yeah.
And 200 gallons of seawater weighs a ton.
Mm.
And sometimes we would have to shift a few tons of water with the buoyancy.
Mm.
Once we actually slowed down. I kept a diary at the time, and I actually have all of this written in my old diary, handwritten diary. And once we hadn't slowed down for more than 10 days. And once we slowed down, we started sinking.
Oh, gosh.
And I was pumping water out furiously, and we were going down and down and down and down and down. And I think I ended up pumping out, I can't remember the amount, but it was hundreds of tons of water because I hadn't done the calculations accurately enough. Yeah. Anyway, we got through. We arrived in the Falklands area, actually off South Georgia, about the 25th of April. And there was a little bit of liveliness down there, but it came to a quick halt. An Argentinian diesel submarine was attacked and sort of slumped to one side and hit something, and it was all over very, very quickly. Mm. And so the next thing was, I suppose we've got to head off to the Falklands. And so off we went. But there's a lot of water around the Falklands, stretching all over the place, the Atlantic, one side looking at Africa and the other side at South America. Mm. And our area was to go down to the southern part of the Falklands, southern waters, and simply to patrol. The British government had established what they called an exclusion zone, 200-mile limit around the island, so that Argentinian surface and subsurface vessels were not allowed to maneuver within that 200-mile range. And so our job essentially was to patrol it, to monitor and observe any vessels that we might see or pick up with sonar. And that's what we did. It started in late April. I can't remember the exact date off the top of my head, but we picked up on our equipment. We could sense the fact that there were some vessels not too far away, and they turned out to be an Argentinian cruiser, the ARA Belgrano, 2 Argentinian destroyers, the Hipólito Bouchard at the Puerta Buena, and an escort ship. And in fact, I first saw them on the 30th of April. We had come shallow and I was looking through the periscope. And I will never forget it, the sight of them. They were refueling at sea. And so all 4 ships were actually joined together in a line. Wow. And you could see the wires and the fueling lines in between them. And I think I wrote in my diary, would have made a superb target.
Yeah.
And it's not, I was actually raised as a Buddhist, and it's not because I'm into killing, so it may sound odd that I went into the Navy. But in that environment, we didn't really think like that. We were, the nature of our training, and I think the strength of our training was that we had to, as much as we could, obliterate all other thoughts. Mm-hmm. We are British, we're on a submarine, and that's the enemy. And that's how we had to think.
Yeah.
On the 1st of May, things seemed to be hotting up a little bit. We were getting bits of information from here and there. That there had been some possible encounters, light ones. And on the 2nd of May, we had obviously been reporting the position of the vessels that we had been monitoring. And on the 2nd of May, we had to, excuse me, I get a little bit funny over this.
Yeah, don't worry.
On the 2nd of May, we received a signal authorizing us to attack the Belgrano and her escorts. So we did. Sorry.
Seth, don't worry about it. Do you want to take a break and we come back to it?
No, I want to get it out of the way, really.
Okay, sure.
So just before 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we fired 3 Mark 8 torpedoes at the Belgrano. And I was my main job, although I've mentioned being the supply and logistics officer and the buoyancy officer, the trimming officer, my main job actually, I haven't even mentioned, was actually as a ship control officer of the watch.
Right.
The control room on the submarine was divided into two sides. The starboard side was my side, and I used to be standing like a bandstand. It was known as the bandstand. And in front of me, I had two planesmen, the foreplanes and the aft planes, who maintained depth and course. I had control panels, basically looking after the course, speed, and depth of the submarine, the buoyancy, the speed that she was going at, and taking care of anything that went untoward that happened, like a hydraulic leak, a water leak, a high pressure air burst, all of these saltwater leaks, all of this I had to do something about. So I was known as ship control. On the port side of the control room were what were known as the tactical team, the usually the first lieutenant or the captain, the navigating officer, the sonar officer, and people like that. The captain was on the attack periscope. There are two periscopes. The attack one is a much smaller, thinner one, so much more difficult for an enemy to see if the waters have come.
Sure.
Submarine obviously is still underwater, but just the top of the periscope sticks out about 1 foot, 1.5 foot. We fired 3 weapons. We used the Mark 8s rather than the other ones we had because they had very high explosive content, 810 pounds each. Basically, World War II torpedoes that had actually been designed around the First World War and simply upgraded. We heard and felt the first one hit the Belgrano a few seconds later, and in fact we heard and felt all 3 of the weapons hit. The captain shouted after the second hit he could see flashes of orange fire, and immediately after that, the thing to do was to leave the scene as quickly as possible in case one of the escorts came after us. And so the captain slammed up the periscope handles, and we went deep to a few hundred feet, listening. We could hear multiple explosions. Submarine was actually trembling a little bit, and one of the clocks on the bulkhead, the front of the clock, opened up and almost fell off the wall.
Wow.
That's how close we were and how strong the explosions were. We ran for an hour. We heard a lot more explosions. At first, we thought that the destroyers were dropping depth charges on us because it felt like it. But it turns out probably that it was the boilers exploding on board the Belgrano.
Right. Yeah.
We weren't able to get to a shallow enough depth to transmit our signal until about an hour and a half or 2 hours after we'd actually fired the weapons. So we then informed HQ. The remainder of that patrol, I mean, obviously after that, we actually went back the next morning to finish off the job and attack the 2 destroyers. But when we were there, we saw that they had a hospital ship and attendants with them, and so we backed away.
Right.
The remainder of the patrol, well, was long and fairly uneventful. We had one event on the 7th of May where we actually thought we were going to die in about 55 seconds' time. I'd just come into the wardroom for lunch and sat down. And on a nuclear submarine, the captain will never say full ahead. Because when you say full ahead on a nuclear submarine, it means you override all of the nuclear safety, the reactor safety.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
That means this is life and death. All the safety precautions, so the reactor could melt through the bottom of the submarine. Literally.
Oh, gosh. Hell.
If you don't control many things in the reactor, you could have what's called a meltdown. And I was in the wardroom, and the petty officer steward was there, and suddenly the submarine went that angle, and the captain went full ahead.
Goodness me.
And I looked at the petty officer steward, Russell, and said, "Oh shit, Russ, this is it." And I looked at the bar. We had a wardroom bar. I thought I might as well throw a shot of rum down. But it didn't happen. We thought what had happened at the time, it felt as though there had been a Neptune aircraft which was dropping buoys and we believed that the Neptune had dropped an aerial launch torpedo, and it missed us.
Mm.
Other than that event, really, the patrol went on. We actually went inside Argentine territorial waters within their 12-mile limit.
Mm.
I could see the coast of Argentina. So that was interesting. In fact, of South Georgia, going back a little bit, I'd actually seen the coast of South Georgia. We could see glaciers. We could hear the Fortuna Glacier from 500 miles away.
Wow.
This was the power of sonar equipment. And we could see seals, mottled seals, standing vertically up through the sea. And so they were waving at us.
Yeah.
So we spent a hell of a long time there until mid-June, when the war was declared over and we were told we could head back home. And we finally got back up the River Clyde at the beginning of July. I think we'd been away for 90 or 91 days. So it was a long patrol. As we came up the River Clyde, they had tugboats all over the place, spraying water through their hoses as gestures of welcome home.
Yeah.
2 at the front, 2 at the back.
Yeah.
And thousands of people lining the jetty. We were flying the Jolly Roger flag. I don't know if I sent you, but I have a photograph of myself. I was allowed on the bridge because it was my last commission. I'd resigned from the Navy.
Yeah.
And because of that, I was invited. I wouldn't normally have been on the bridge. First thing I was told to do was to surface the submarine by actually opening the valves and doing all of that. I was shitting myself, but I did it. And but the second one, and I'll send you the photograph, is again, I'm actually one of the few people up right on the top of the bridge. And the welcoming home was amazing. One slightly amusing incident, excuse me for saying it, but the captain was Captain Chris Reeford Brown, then Commander Chris Reeford Brown. And there was a huge sign along the bank saying, "Welcome home, Chris." And one of our, I won't mention his name, but one of our artificers on board, who was also on the bridge, screamed out, standing behind the captain, "Who the fuck is Chris?" You can imagine there was a bit of a grim silence. And that is really true. It's quite famous now. Yeah. So we went back alongside to a lot of fanfare and stuff. I didn't have any family there to meet me, so I sort of, ambled down to the pub and thought, no, it's time for a beer or 11. And that was the end of it. It was the longest 90-day period in my life, I think.